Operation Vulindlela.
You're with Clement Mayathela.
702.
Rudi is the head of the project management office in the private office of the president. He joins us in studio. You'll remember that in his State of the Nation address, President Cyril Ramaphosa announced the second phase of Operation Vulindlela will be focusing on reforming the local government system and improving service delivery. The president first announced Operation Vulindlela in 2020, describing the program as a means to fast-track the delivery of economic reforms and support economic recovery. And this is an initiative, really, that was created by the Presidency and National Treasury to boost economic growth and create jobs through targeted reforms. So it's intended to modernize and transform network industries, including electricity, water, transport, digital communications, you name it. So what has it been able to achieve, especially now as we move to phase two? We'll start by looking at what has been achieved in phase one, and what are they looking to do for phase two as well. You can join this chat if you've got inputs or you've got questions on 011-883-0702 or send a WhatsApp on 072-702-1702. Rudi, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for making time for us.
Morning, Clement. Thanks for inviting me.
So I want us to start, of course, with the first phase of Operation Vulindlela. It concentrated a lot on infrastructure, departments to leverage this economic inclusion interventions. What have you been able to achieve? So what were your targets for phase one and what have you been able to achieve?
Thanks, Clement. Just perhaps to remind, there were 5 areas, and the reason why we focused on 5 areas in particular was, we had to prioritize specifically these aspects that could have the quickest impact on economic growth. And economic growth is an important catalyst because what it does, it is about investment and then, of course, employment. And we said we're going to focus on energy and energy security. We're going to focus on logistics and reforming the logistics systems. We said we're going to look at water and bulk water systems. We said we're going to look at telecommunication and particularly the issues relating to a spectrum. And the third aspect was visa reforms. So when we announced, and the president announces as part of, the economic and recovery program as part of the post-COVID response, this was quite an important area of work. But the essence of the reform program was to try and develop an approach where we could, in a sense, Clement, fast track some of the reforms and policy decisions we've taken, like on energy, for example. We talked about, the unbundling of Eskom and creating a separate transmission company and generation and distribution. Or, for instance, allowing private sector to participate in generation capacity. So a lot of these was trying to open up the economic areas and spaces that were really dominated by SOEs. But not, I think it's important to separate that from privatization. It is the policy decisions that we've taken. So let's use energy. Energy white paper was developed in 1998. And it's only in the last 3 to 4 years that we've actually fully implemented partially much of those reforms, and those reforms still continue.
Yeah.
So in the energy space, for example, in 2022, we'd changed a particular set of regulations that allowed for private generation and allowed for private generation to only register, and for where they build a generation plant, they could use the transmission network to transport the electrons from one place to another place. So that's fundamental. The space was always dominated by Eskom, and so, for example, Eskom would be the sole offtake of generation capacity, even through the IPP program. In this instance, Eskom would not be the sole off-taker. Private generators would build a generation plant and sell it off to private off-takers like mines, for example, retailers, for example, manufacturing firms, and others. And that's quite important. So a success of this was, one of the key successes was that as soon as we made those changes, we were able to see today, we track about 131 private sector projects, totaling 22,000 megawatts. Now, just comparatively speaking, Eskom, if we give it any day, Eskom produces probably between 30 and 35,000 megawatts every single day. So if you think of that 22,000 as quite a huge amount of megawatts that's been produced by the private sector, not sold to Eskom, to other users, and totaling about 390 billion rand worth of investment. So much of that is coming on stream over the next few years. It started way back in 2023. Last year we saw about 2,800 megawatts. This year we expect slightly more. 2026, 2027.
Is that being sold to Eskom or to
No,
other
that's not. Those are sold to private off-takers. So let's just say a mine, Clement's coal mine, and for example, let's use some of the examples. No, I don't want to use some of the examples. I don't want to advertise for them, right? But there are certain miners, for example, in the coal space or elsewhere that have, for example, said, I want to build a generation capacity for my own use. But I have mines in different parts of the country. So I'm going to build a 500 megawatt plant out in the Northern Cape. And I want to dispatch the electricity that I produce over there to my 4 or 5 mines throughout the country.
Okay.
And so that's fundamental. That's never happened before. And it essentially breaks down the single buyer model or the vertically integrated model, where everything goes through Eskom. And that's been a fundamental reform where we've allowed for private sector participation into the generation space.
When does the private sector itself start adding some of that electricity on the grid? So is that part of the plan? Because as we talk about decarbonization or the just energy transition at some point, I'm wondering whether the IPPs then end up adding capacity to our grid.
Absolutely. That's fundamentally why this is important, because at the end of the day, given the debt moratorium conditions for Eskom, although, part of the intervention around the Energy Action Plan, one of it is to build more megawatts. And the option is for the private sector to do that. So as they get more megawatts onto the grid, it eases the ability for Eskom to run into problems as we have in the last, this year, thrice already. So certainly what you want to see is as quickly as possible those megawatts coming into the grid. Now, remember, technically speaking, they're not bought by Eskom. But if a huge mine that consumes 200 megawatts of power is getting a third or half of their power through other generation source, it means that demand from Eskom reduces, and it allows Eskom to be able to meet its obligation. So this is an important reform around energy. And of course, as we see that play out and the investments happening, we're quite excited about it. There's lots of private generators that are coming in, lots of investments. Standard Bank, for example, we're talking about, their capital allocations increasing significantly. So RMB the same, Investec and others were certainly putting funding aside, looking at bankable projects that had allowed this. So,
and there's no red tape for these companies to do that.
Lots of red tape. We in fact had to sit through and deal with a whole series of different things. Water use license, for example, was the main constraint. Grid access, for example, land use, environmental impact assessments. And Clement, what we then did, because when we changed the law, we kind of said, but you guys had asked for this. Where's the investments? And they said, well, we can't do investments because we're stuck in red tape, We got to wait a year for a water use license. So one of the things we did do with the Department of Water and Sanitation is to redesign the water use license application system, the HULA system. And 70% today of all applications are done within 3 months versus what they were more than 1 year. Environmental impact assessments, for example, we were able to reduce it from excess of 6 to 12 months to also under 57 days, So these are important red tape introductions. We launched what we refer to as an energy one-stop shop. It still exists today. And we're hoping that we could, for example, use that energy one-stop shop for other sectors,
Okay.
But that was a fundamental reform that was important to deal with red tape and a whole series of things that prevents investment.
Is it fair to attribute the successes we have seen at Eskom in as far as the reduction of load shedding is concerned to the work that Operation Vulindlela has done?
It's a combination. It's a combination of different things. I think the fact that the president has taken this as a central part of his intervention and appointed the Minister of Electricity. The fact that we set up the National Energy Crisis Committee, chaired by himself and taking responsibility. The fact that Operation Vulindlela were doing some of the interventions to support both the president and the minister.
Yeah.
The fact that we got new leadership in Eskom with Dan Marakane and some of the others. I think they're all combinations of a different thing. But I want to, err on the side of caution. I mean, we always said the only way we can resolve our electricity crisis is if we have more megawatts. And we've got to make sure that that does happen, So all of these things are quite critical. The major thing, as we wait for private sector investment that has helped, for example, to alleviate the grid, is the fact that we've seen a doubling of PV rooftops. So you and I, the middle class and the wealthy have put up rooftop PVs to get themselves also less dependent on the grid, on Eskom. And so you've seen that, for example, doubled over the last year and a half. And that's quite important because it shows again that, households were able to depend less and use their own energy sources, given that we have the best, PV resources.
I want us to run quickly through the others. We've dealt with energy now. What about water? Because that's the next crisis now.
Absolutely. When we did the first phase of water, it was really looking at setting up the National Water Resource Infrastructure Agency. So we were dealing with systemic changes that would help in the short to medium term to deal with that. So we set up the National Water Resource Infrastructure. Think of that as a SANDRAL for water, where we needed to have a single body that can look at investment in securing water for the next 30, 40, 50 years, right? Because that's important. Bulk water pricing was an important strategy also, since that was inconsistent. The next phase, as you probably were going to talk about, is how do we deal with distribution of water? That's where it's at. And so we got to think through how we deal with the systemic challenges that are there, particularly around maintenance in municipalities. This municipality, of course, high non-revenue water, which is just water losses that we can't account for, in excess of 40%. eThekwini, for example, when we started last year, similar, 62%. Non-revenue water losses. And you see that steady growth in non-revenue water losses because of poor maintenance, because of, a whole series of different things that have caused that. So water is certainly that. As I said, the one thing that we do is to try and improve water use licenses. So that's a win that I think is important, because one of the key concerns that investors have raised, why does it take us more than a year to get a water use license? Please, guys, can you just build efficiency in the system? And we did help the department, for example, to do that.
Yeah, and I think, at the end of the day, this is about red tape.
Yeah,
because I was speaking to someone just yesterday who's building up a portfolio because they have to tender with government, and the amount of work they have to do. And I was just asking, because I took a keen interest in, what does it take? Like the documents you need to get, you need to drive all the way to Pretoria, do this. It makes it impossible to do business with government.
Clement,
and Sipho Nkosi was appointed by the president to cut the red tape. I had him on the show, and he himself was frustrated by the same red tape he was supposed to cut.
Look, I think what we've done is to try and deal with a lot. Look, there's always going to be red tape. I fall on my sword. I think fundamentally your point is correct. We got to make smart decisions around how we manage this, because you got to have some degree of red tape. For example, if you don't deal with red tape around food regulation in municipalities, what happens when kids die, right? So you got to enforce that. Now, some people complain about, the Department of Health regulations around this is onerous. Or for example, applications for, connection to the grid. If you're getting some, unqualified electrician to connect you to the grid because you want to save cost of doing it, these are the things that are important. But there's certainly some easy wins, right? Like, for example, building permits and the process. And a lot of these things are such an important part, but you can translate the period, right? Like why does it have to take a year for you to get a water use license when you can do it in less than 3 months? So you got to design efficiency in the system, and that's what we've learned, for example. The same with environmental impact assessments. If you can do an environmental impact assessment, let's think about many of the mines have built their PV plants on mining land. You're destroying the land by digging a hole, which is worse than putting a PV plant on top of the land. You're you're not messing with the land. You're simply putting a PV plant in. Your impact assessment should be less onerous than when you're doing and digging a hole for mining. So I think certainly we got to think about this, in a way that I think would be quite critical. One of the things that we got to do, and part of the responsibility that I have, different to OV, is the red tape work. So we're continuing Siping courses work, and specifically looking at a number of things like visas, for example. This is another area that
let's get into that one. Yeah. So, because I've seen there've been movements there.
Yeah.
What have you been able to move, and how is that going to at least affect and have an impact on our economy?
Absolutely. So the one critical thing we did was, Mavusa Msamang, the former Director General of the Department of Home Affairs, you know him as one of the veterans of the ANC, for example, very technically sound, did a report for us on what we should do around the visa reforms. And one of those things that we did, for example, was introduce a visa that allows, for example, companies to manage their own visas, and this was an important part of the system, right? We introduced, for example, a points-based system, and we got to implement that right now. That was quite a critical area of the work that we've done. And so a lot of this was to smooth out, for example, some of the stuff that have been critically impacting on businesses to be able to invest, and where multinationals invest, we're able to do that, right? What's nice right now in the next phase, we're looking at a fully electronic travel authorization system. And we did this during the World Cup, by the way. We had millions of people coming to the World Cup. And no one asked, kind of like, how did we do it? How we were successful to facilitate millions of people coming into 2010? It's because we had electronic travel authorization system. And this is
How did that work?
I mean, most ETA systems basically work today. If you travel, I attended the conference of the parties, which is the COP thing, and we went to Dubai, and you on the system, you apply, you punch in your details. They ask you for a limited number of documentations relevant to ensuring that you are who you are. And, 30 minutes later, there's an acknowledgement on the system. And then a few hours later, they issue an electronic visa, right? And you print that out, or you screen grab it on your phone, and that's sufficient enough with your travel documentation to show that you can have access. Now, of course,
that's for how many days? Like maybe 3 days or...
It depends on the system. So, just think about it for tourism. You give a month visa or 3-month visa. The point is not, for how much you apply for. The point is, how can I get quickly access if I'm not going to do anything that's going to break the law? So the vast majority of Chinese, for example, would love to visit us because they like South Africa. South Africa, for example, has the best of both worlds. You can come here to Sandton and shop and have, all the trimmings of a beautiful city. But I can travel another 100 kilometers and I'm in the bushveld.
Yeah.
Right? And so this is important. But how do I come here and make it easier for me to do that? And I know I'm going to go back home. So we've got to think about that. And then, of course, it can't be driven by security decisions, right? So you've got to have the back-end system working fairly well. And there are sophisticated systems globally that, red flag individuals, if Clement traffics, or Rudi traffics, not me use Clement, let's say Rudi.
God forbid.
Rudi is trafficking, miners and stuff like that. These things are known because you tap into the various systems that are there,
Yeah, I really don't, I worry about red tape because I don't think there's a solution yet. I think government is such a bureaucratic nightmare. And the president has really tried, I'll give him credit for that, by getting someone in the private sector to assist. But unfortunately, that man was frustrated himself. I see the work you do with Operation Vulindlela, but I really worry that the government is a beast of bureaucracy. And I don't know how we are ever whether it's even possible for us to get to a point where we really make it easy for things to move around. In the next half hour after the headlines, we're going to get into the second phase of Operation Vulindlela. But I want to ask, how do you work with the government departments?
Yeah.
Because some of the responsibilities you have could be responsibilities that are carried out by the respective government departments. I just think the president thought well by bringing in people who are going to fast track the reforms, because again, our government departments can really be slow, and these are things that are needed urgently. How do you work with them?
Yeah. I mean, this was an important decision that we've made, right? Because what we're trying to do is, in a sense, is coordinate from the center of government, which is the presidency, right, with National Treasury. And the reforms, and this is pertinent to point out that we don't implement, Clement. So our responsibility is not to implement. Our responsibility is to try and ensure that we support the implementing departments. And so we define that quite clearly. So when the reforms have to happen, there's an implementation plan that is signed off by the minister and the director general and the department. We then track that. We intervene if there's a request, or we raise and hold people accountable. Because that's quite important. You've got to have that distinction. I mean, you can't have a presidency that's going to implement. Then there's no reason for other departments. Departments have a functional responsibility in their mandates that are there. You've got to support and ensure that it does happen. So energy is an important area. Logistics, again, transport. And the work that we're doing to improve the rail efficiency and port efficiency. We've got to work with the Department of Transport. And Minister Creasy, for example, there is quite, well attuned to the reform program. And is able to implement much of the reform program. So stay away from implementation. That's critical, because then you're delving into an area that is not your mandate, right? And this is your bureaucracy somewhat is that.
But what's the point of planning and coming up with ways to fast-track reforms only to be frustrated by the slow implementation in the government?
But that's where the trick is. That's why the implementation plans are such an important part. So for example, as we did in phase 1, we are now going to develop an implementation plan which is very detailed. So it's very specific. You got to do X, and we got to say by when, right? So you're familiar. We do quarterly reports, So we have a dashboard there that indicates who's behind and not behind. Many departments don't want to be behind and don't want to be read, right? So that's quite an important part. And the ownership of the program is politically owned by the president. And so there's potentially engagements also with ministers when they form behind. And so this is an accountability mechanism that the president has also built into the system. So if you're behind, you can't be frustrated. You've got to say to us, sorry, if I set the end of March to achieve this, but I can't, you got to say, I can't achieve this because of this reason, not because I just can't achieve that.
Yeah.
Right? And so that accountability mechanism is quite an important part of the way that we approach OV. And many of the ministers are attuned to it, but they also enjoy the systematic changes in the standard bureaucracy. That there's a different way of trying to deliver and execute implementation. And so that excites, I think, a lot of the ministers, that some of them are frustrated with the slow execution. They themselves also raise bureaucracy as a problem in achieving some of their goals.
When do we start seeing the benefits of the programs that Operation Vulindlela is making? Because you and I can have this conversation on air. Someone listening to us at home or in the car, in the office, is thinking, how does it affect me?
Yeah, true.
The economy is still not growing at the rate it should be growing. There are still crazy high levels of unemployment. We still have the challenges that we have. And the president promised, when I implement these reforms, there will be an impact.
Yeah. I mean, to be frank with you, that is a big concern for us, because doing the reforms is about driving growth, right? And when we did the initial modeling, we said that if we do the reforms over the next... Now, people can't wait for 5 years, but we did this model. We said over the next 5 years, we should see a 3 to 3.5% increase on the baseline. Now, that's very different to the 2% less growth. And if you get 3 to 3.5% growth on the baseline, that's when the multipliers kick in for employment and job creation.
When are we expecting to hit that mark?
Well, Clement, again, it depends on how confident people are that we're driving the reform fast enough, how confident the people are that we're sticking to it, and how confident we're creating an environment for private sector investment.
But based on your pace now, are you seeing that in 4 years? Are you seeing that in... Well,
I mean, we through the business collaboration, for example, we're saying that we should try and see 3% growth as quickly as possible. I mean, a lot of, for example, what was suggested was that we want to see at least 3% growth in the next year or two, we got to sustain that. So it's not just a blip, right? It's not just, okay, we're doing 3% 1 year. I mean, again, we got to create my point about this is that you got to create an environment for investment, and then you got to sustain it. So it's not just, okay, we're attracting you to invest, but we got to sustain that with the reforms, reducing red tape, make it easier for people to invest. The multiplier of that, if it's high, is that unemployment is then decreased.
Okay, it's 10:32.
You're with Clement Mayathela.
702. Let's walk the talk.
It's 23 minutes now before 11 o'clock, in conversation with Rudi, who is the head of the project management office in the private office of the president. We're talking about Operation Vulindlela and what it's been able to achieve in phase one. Remember when the president came into office, his first term, he promised these economic reforms, and what Operation Vulindlela, working with the Presidency and Treasury, is aiming to do is to start really pushing and fast-tracking the implementation of those reform decisions that were taken by the president. We've heard what they've been able to do in phase one. We'll touch on what phase two will be focusing on, but I want you to also weigh in on this conversation. You can call on 011-883-0702 or send a WhatsApp on 072-702-1702.
Hi, Clement. With regard to the red tape on water use licenses, environmental impact assessment, I'm involved with those. It's actually more about the capacity and experience of officials who review and make decisions. But because they can't differentiate between an application that requires more stringent requirements and less stringent requirements, there's indecisiveness from the officials, and we're still experiencing long delays. Bazooka from Pretoria.
Yeah, ready?
No, Bazooka's right. I mean, I think this is something that we try. I use the example of land use, for example, and an impact assessment when you're building, you got to do an EAA for doing a mine versus an EA for building a PV plant on mining area. And of course, those are two distinct features around how you would do an environmental impact assessment. So certainly I think that is something that is correctly spot on. I know that the Department of Water and Sanitation the Department of Environmental Affairs is looking at significantly improving the system, and they've done that over the years by reducing it. There are, of course, I mean, it's not a generality, but there are specific cases where, as you know, for example, it goes on to extended periods depending on the complexity. The water use licensing system, for example, has reformed, and so the complexity always is in areas where there's water scarcity. And so the sort of water use license that have been applied for, and I know in Limpopo, for example, there's always been delays because of the scarcity of water, for instance. But I think generally speaking, from what we track on the data, is that there's a broad improvement in trying to improve those two biggest constraints. There are many other constraints as well. Because remember, you've got this complexity of the bureaucracy that is layered. So you've got national regulations, you've got provincial regulations, and then you have municipal regulations. What we've been able to do is, in a sense, try and smooth out and reduce levels of efficiency at national. We've got to sit with municipalities and say, what is it that we've got to do to improve it, and work with provinces to be able to do some of the stuff that I think which is logic. But Bazooka's right. I mean, I think that's really about how we can fix and improve rate.
All right. Letlhagonolo, you're calling from Pretoria. Good morning.
Good morning. I feel pity for Rudi, man. Rudi, my name is Letlhagonolo. I just want to give you a clear indicator of what really is a red tape within government. We have to call it by the name. It's the love for bribery. I've been applying for water use license for the past 6 years. I can tell you we've got operations in Namibia. We are able to access information in Namibia. We are able to access information in Mozambique and also in Chile faster than we can with our DMRE. Simply because people put the red tape in the name of bureaucracy, but we know exactly once you can entangle them with money, then
it moves faster.
Exactly. Now, these are the things that I think as South African we keep tiptoeing around, and hence you find DGs that runs departments year after year with unqualified or wasteful expenditures without consequences, because we keep tiptoeing around real issues. But I want to tell you that, in my industry, somebody that is sitting with money in Australia right now has got a choice to invest in Botswana more than in South Africa, as Fraser Alexander International Study did, mention. We have got to whip people in line. We cannot continue. Otherwise, we are going to talk like this until 2030 with economy that is stagnating beyond 4%.
Great. Great contribution there. Thank you for sharing that experience with us. That's a reality, Rudi.
It is, and if he has water use license applications that have been waiting for 6 years, please share with him my details so that we try and see what we can do to be able to block it.
Okay, let's
that's
give
important.
Lehlogonolo. Let's link Lehlogonolo with Rudi.
Yeah.
And give him Rudi's details so Rudi maybe can try and help out with that water licensing issue.
Absolutely,
Yeah?
but he's again also spot on. I mean, that's why it's important for us to move to electronic based systems, right? So we don't have the manipulation of either regulations or licenses that have to be applied. Water use license, electronic water use licenses, is one of the more important systems where you're able to see applications that have been submitted. And similarly now with the mining license, I suspect he's in the mining sector, because certainly, we've not been able to get the kind of mining opportunities, particularly because of red tape. And so I think the quicker we move from paper-based to electronic-based systems, it would cut out potential.
Why are we still not there? Because that really shocks me. For a country, the president always talks about the fourth industrial revolution. Things are moving. We're going to be caught behind.
I know.
How is it that, you go to a police station, you see how they still store and save their cases. Or you go to hospital and you see how your medical history and how it's kept. We are still obsessed with paper when things are moving digital, and we're going to wake up when it's too late. And that's what contributes to the delays.
No, totally. One of the 3 new reforms is digital transformation. And to start off with the most basic, right, is digital identification. You and I, or anyone, or Gogo in the township that has a digital identification and can access services across the government system by not having to open up a file here and open up a file there. And when she goes and draw money for pension, they have the same system, or where she has to go to a public hospital, or whether she has to access services across the system. I think that's fundamental, and that's an exciting part of the new thing. Similarly for digital payments, we pay 25 million people, so we got to think about how we deal with that. Our ability to interface with the private sector around that is going to be phenomenal and will revolutionize it. But it's part of that systemic changes that we're trying to introduce, and one of those is the digital transformation of our society, so that we bring government into a digital age, and that's going to be important for us. So your point is,
I hope we'll get there. Well, I'm still alive. I hope in my lifetime we'll see that digital transformation. Okay, there are more calls coming through that I'll get to them in a bit, but please help us understand what the second phase of Operation Vulindlela will be focusing on. The president said there'll be reforms in the local government system, improving service delivery. What exactly is going to be your focus area?
Well, absolutely. But don't forget, we have not completed all the reforms in the other 5. So although for telecommunications we've done the reform, it was the auction primarily of the spectrum. And you'll be familiar with that. We sold it and we made a few billion rand. But most importantly, we were able to give it to the private sector. And since that, that's one of the successes. We've seen an average price of a 1.5 gigabyte data package been dropped by 51%. And some of us who have kids who buy airtime, we know the price of airtime has come down. So what we'll continue to do is finish through the reforms for both water, for electricity. Those reforms are still important. We've got to carry them through. For transport, much of those reforms have come through much later in 2023, 2024, so we've got a lot of work still to do there. And then visa, as I said, on the ETA. There are 3 additional reforms that we said we're going to focus on also. Number 1 is local government, And systemically there, we're talking about specifically around service delivery in two aspects. I mean, we've got to see service delivery improvements across the system, but we thought it's quite important that we don't dissipate, right? So we focus on what can we do around electricity and water, because that is the critical services that we all need, right? And one of the areas there, for example, that we're suggesting, Clement, is ring fencing of those utility functions. So let me explain what that means. So in most municipalities, you don't have it ring fence. It is not a separate structure. Let's use City Power, for instance. So City Power looks like a utility, right? It has a separate corporate structure, but its income and expenditure is not ring fenced. For example, the money that it derives from selling electricity goes into the council. It doesn't say into City Power, for example. Similarly with Johannesburg Water, right? Now, of course, what that happens is that a large chunk of that cross-subsidizes, and it's important for cross-subsidization. There is a level of cross-subsidization. But when you've got to do CapEx programs, for example, you now got to rely on the council instead of your own revenue collection that you've done. So utility ring fencing is quite important for us to be able to ensure that that utility invests its money and resources into maintenance and CapEx. So we want to do that as part of the first phase for metros, right? And for both water and electricity. You could do similarly for waste, solid waste treatment also. But we think that that's the important part. Now that's quite revolutionary because a lot of us have been talking about that for years, but we kind of never did it, right? So we've got to work with municipalities to ensure that that kind of intervention. And that deals fundamentally with ensuring that utilities have a clear maintenance program. They stick to their CapEx. Or you'll have what we have in many parts of our country, where the maintenance have lapsed, or there's no CapEx budgets to replace the pipes or the distribution network for electricity. The second part for local government is professionalization. So we want to, as we've done in national and provincial government, is separate the bureaucracy from the political appointments. So that tends to be conflated, more so in local government, The municipal manager and his or her staff gets quite, they're in the cold face of this. So we've got to professionalize and ensure that we protect the integrity of the system. So as, we get into coalition governments, the system continues to function and is not dependent on the political negotiations. So very much the same as elections happen at the national government level, us in the bureaucracy, we still got an important responsibility to deliver. Grants payments don't stop. Delivery of basic services don't stop. Our functions don't stop as elections. And so sometimes we've been able to not do that adequately.
How do we do that?
So what we've done, for example, at a national level is introduce a framework for professionalization, which is run by the Public Service Commission, and that is adopted by national government and cabinet. That talks specifically about a professionalization framework, right? And most importantly, separating political and the bureaucracy. They've got two distinct functions, but they've got to work together, and I think that's the most important. As a professional bureaucrat, as a public servant, we've got to do and make sure the function of the state. The executive authority, of course, comes in when there's elections and they get appointed. And they got a particular set of responsibility relative to the accounting authority. You've got to create that distinction.
Yeah.
And sometimes you see that conflation happening.
And you see the tension between the executive authority and the accounting authority, where the minister doesn't like the DG because the DG doesn't want to follow certain instructions that they feel maybe are unethical or unlawful. I mean, the DA, when they came in at some point, wanted to be involved in the appointment of DGs. How do you then protect the accounting officer?
Yeah.
Because for some reason, the political officers, the executive authority, somehow can have an audience with the president. They exercise so much power that sometimes they frustrate the accounting officer, let's say in the case of DGs. And I think the Public Service Commission once recommended that maybe lengthen the contracts of the DGs, for instance.
I mean, that proper performance management, proper skills development training for the public service. Most importantly, what came out of the National Development Plan is a professionalization framework that refers to as the head of the public service, which is the DG in the presidency, and the head, which is short as Hopper. is to be able to play that important role that supports public service and public service transformation and development. So you got to have that. Many democracies, just think about Canada, for example. A lot of our systems is based on the Canadian and the UK. They too have the same system when there's change in, Canada's 200 years of democracy. But some ministers that come in and say, I don't want that DG, for example, and so you can't, simply change the DGs, right? In the way that you change political officers. So you've got to find mechanisms where you've got to, as public servants, you're professional, and therefore the political authorities that come in have to accept that, unless of course there's something seriously wrong with the bureaucrats.
Yeah, here's a challenge though, Rudi. When you look at municipalities, the politicians field candidates or councillors that don't even have matric to be in council. And council then votes for someone who doesn't or only has matric, who can't even read a financial statement. But they're supposed to be in the finance portfolio, or they're supposed to hold accountable institutions and at least have a basic understanding of economics and finances. So how do you deal with that aspect? Because even tomorrow, you and I can run for office, whether we've got experience or not. I could be mayor. You could be mayor, Rudi.
You would be a good mayor.
So how do we deal with that? Because for as long as politicians are not forced to get councillors or people in councils in the context of local government who at least have a matric or some postgraduate certificate, then our municipalities are going to continue to go down the hole like we see them do.
It's difficult for me to respond to that because political parties have to take responsibility for ensuring that the candidates do have the necessary skills, do have the necessary experience, have the necessary qualifications to engage on their political responsibility when they're elected to council. What we can do, of course, is quite critically is to build capacity and develop councillors to be able to understand complex issues around decisions, for example, around financing or an integrated development plan, or measures of technically how do we improve revenue collection, for example, in the city of Johannesburg as an example. So until political parties, of course, across the spectrum, improve on how they get the right people into the right positions, what we can do as officials is really ensure that we simplify and provide the necessary technical skills to councillors to be able to perform their functions. And that should be the responsibility of council and the political parties and the administration at the end of the day. But it's a tough one. I can't give you an answer for that one.
Okay.
That's a political party answer.
Mm-hmm. I want to quickly, because there are some questions here coming from our listeners. Kennedy says, Clement, please can you ask Rudi, isn't what they're doing a duplication of implementation? Why don't they just copy and paste that DOGE concept from the US? That's being led by President Elon Musk.
Clement, you know I want to generally disassociate myself from the dog process, right? I think the team there is trying to deal with cutting costs and a whole series of different things. By the way, as you saw, the Minister of Finance made that intervention that we're going to work politically together with Treasury and ourselves on cutting costs and looking at, reprioritization of the budget. This is not about cutting costs. This is about implementing decisions we've taken over many years, decades sometimes. Let me tell you about the spectrum thing. 12 years ago, I used the example of the electricity, 1998. This is about implementing decisions that are growth enhancing. They're not about cutting costs in the way that that team in the US is doing. It's more about creating an opportunity for economic growth and creating competition and getting private sector to invest. So it's quite distinct, and I think it's important for us to we're not here to cut and say this program doesn't work. That's a process for National Treasury and ourselves, as announced by the Minister, in his budget speech.
Okay. And then just lastly, Judith says, Clement, I don't think that South Africa's visa system and follow-up is strong enough. European countries have strict visa regulations, yet they have millions of tourists visiting their countries annually. SA has more to offer. Many foreigners, especially from the global north, are coming into South Africa on a visitor's visa and working, some of them illegally in the country, crossing land borders to neighboring countries, giving them additional time in South Africa to work illegally. So what is that? Because, I mean, going to Europe is something else when you have to go through the visa process, and yet we still flood their markets.
Yeah, I tend to think if one compares it, Europe, interesting, is becoming more bureaucratic. There's so much more red tape that they've been introduced, and you get complaints about it all the time. Visa entry is a difficult. Clement, you and I travel, right? We know how difficult it is for some people to get into the UK, the cost of that. But we're not Europe. We are South Africa. We're a developing country, and therefore, for us to attract critical skills, tourism is a significant sector for us. We've got everything over here. We've got to get tourists into our country. We've got to attract the critical skills, because critical skills, what we don't have, right, has a multiplier effect in employing unskilled workers. So we've got to do that. And so we've got to change the provisions to make it easier for us to attract tourists and to attract critical skills. I certainly, there's lots of examples of people breaking the visa regulations, staying on. I don't want to talk about undocumented workers. But the point about the system is to how we use it to attract economically active people that can spur and grow our economy. And tourism is a good example. We're just at the pinnacle of Africa. We've got the best weather. We've got the best of both worlds. We have, working infrastructure. It's fairly significant. Why can't we attract 100,000 Chinese, or 1 million Chinese, for example, to come and visit us?
Yeah. Rudi Dix, always appreciate your time. I'll be bothering you again probably in 6 months to come give us feedback on the work of Operation Vulindlela. Thank you so much for making time for us.
Thank you, Clement.